Okay, welcome back to our AP review, and I guess I've got some notes over here on my little pad. I just meant that if you're just trying to nail a five, this is probably not the review for you because I'm not going to go through a lot of the sort of American Gov stuff in terms of like, uh, political parties and political ideologies. That's not number one. I think most of you are probably pretty good at that, or at least a lot of people are. Or how to read data. Once again, a lot of people are already good at that. The section of the AP that more students than any other section have difficulty with is the case law, and then going back to primary sources. Relating those cases either to a primary source or, preferably back to a founding document. Um, and this review is really for people who want to have a sort of, I don't want to say comprehensive, but some kind of, like deeper understanding of what's going on. And to see the interrelationship between cases, our founding documents, and maybe some really grander problems in all law. So that's number one. Number two, we live in very intense political times. I, like everybody else, have my own political concerns. I'm generally not a very partisan guy, but I think, we've all got our concerns. And so I want to make sure that one of the things that I hope to endeavor to do, and I hope that anybody listening, whatever your politics are, that you try and separate out your thoughts from your beliefs. And in very brief, all of us have deeply held beliefs. There's something wrong with that. It's a good thing to have deeply held beliefs, but those are unshakable, right? I was raised by a mom who was a very civil rights person in the late 50s, early 60s, and she taught us that God created all humans with equal love and equal care, and they were all important. And if you didn't think that, my mom just didn't have any time for you. And I believe that. You can't shake that belief. I'm never going to shake it. It's just a foundational belief that I have. And so when you're thinking about a lot of political problems, you should ask yourself, I may have strong thoughts, I may have ideas and observations that I think are very, very important, but also be aware of where your hardest beliefs are. And just be aware that your thoughts are things you can articulate to someone and explain to someone who doesn't share your beliefs. Why that's a good idea. For example, is it a good idea for there to be a free market in, I don't know, in oil? Some countries control the price of oil or control the price of gas. Is that a good idea or is that a bad idea? That's really a thought thing versus a belief thing. And I think when we sort of run through our constitutional documents, we need to think about what are our thoughts about these documents, what are our beliefs about America, and to sort of segregate them out. And I hope that will avoid any, undue controversy around this discussion, especially because there's really nothing controversial in anything I'm saying here. I mean, this is really, really solid, kind of old school thinking. Um, and finally, I think we need to sort of get into the document. So, our first document in our AP set is actually the Declaration of Independence. Obviously, every American should read this document, know it well. It literally is kind of what makes us who we are. But interestingly, if you're going to read it, it's really helpful to have read one prior document. Now, this document's not in the AP list. You don't have to know it, but it'll give you some context for the structure of the Declaration of Independence and really an issue in the Declaration, because our Declaration is both extremely universal. It's in many ways the clarion call to human freedom. For generations around the world, people who have sought independence and human freedom have looked to the Declaration of Independence and used it. Even people who we ultimately fought, Ho Chi Minh, when he wrote the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence, partially borrowed from our Declaration of Independence. The French, in their revolution, looked back to our Declaration of Independence. So it's just an extraordinarily important document, and we need to understand it. But we also need to understand that the document has parts, and some of those parts really refer back to the English Bill of Rights. Now, there's no need to, in this context, fully understand the English Bill of Rights, but for what it's worth, you should pull up a copy. They're easy to find. I'll see if I can toggle this thing in on the bottom, but if I don't, just pull up the English Bill of Rights on Google. It's not hard to find. It's 1688, and it's the year that Parliament essentially, in a like quote unquote peaceful way, dispenses with a Catholic king and brings in a Protestant king. The English have been fighting about religion for it's really a long time, since Henry, maybe a little before that. And this document will cement the supremacy of Parliament and the supremacy of Protestantism in England. So why is it important? Well, we should just take a look at it, and you'll see that the complaints, there's a whole complaint section in here, and they are ones that might seem familiar to Americans. For example, says, whereas the late King James, by assistance of diverse evil councils, judges, and ministers employed in him, did endeavor to subvert and extirpate the Protestant religion and laws and liberties of the kingdom, dispensing and suspending power by assuming and exercising a power and suspending laws and executions without the consent of Parliament. So one of the critical things you're going to find in the Declaration is there's a complaint that the king has taken away power from the local American parliaments, which are, the House of Burgesses and other legislative branches here in America. So one of the things that you're going to note is that American freedom is often about the power of the legislature. There's also other complaints that are very much resonate for Americans. Levying money, for example, is in there. By levying money for and to the use of the crown by pretense of prerogative for other time and other manner than the same is granted by Parliament. In other words, the issue here is that the king has essentially established taxes without the Parliament, which represents all Englishmen, consenting. Sounds kind of familiar, right? Whether this is going to come up, we can't go through all of American history and the lead up to the revolution, but this is going to come up as we lead up to our revolution, right? That Americans want to be taxed only by their own consent. And then interestingly, and this is just another one that kind of gives us some thoughts here, it says, by disarming Protestants, by causing several good subjects, being Protestant, to be disarmed at the same time when Papists were both armed and employed contrary to law. Whatever you think about the Second Amendment, it's quite clear, at least to me, that, and to many legal scholars, nothing controversial here, that there's a serious consideration in the Bill of 1688 that you're disarming some people and allowing other people to be armed. So it goes to this big question, right? We have this universal document, this document in the Declaration that declares human freedom in a huge way. But what did that really mean? Especially because as we get into American history, we're going to find that there's a conflict between the universalism of the Declaration and then, the question is, who does that really apply to? And obviously we're seeing that today, right? People who come to America as immigrants, but who are not fully naturalized here, do they have freedom of speech? Can they just say whatever they want? I mean, Americans can say more or less whatever they want, but it's not entirely clear who that applies to if you're here but not naturalized. So I want to get into now the Declaration of Independence, and you'll see that some of the concepts we've talked about are going to flip over pretty neatly into the Declaration. So when you read the Declaration, it has essentially three parts. Part number one is the part with, in the course of human events, it explains that people can leave government. Part number two explains what those circumstances are, what the foundations for new government would be. And then part number three is interesting because it goes and it elucidates the particular complaints that the English in America had about the English in England, or at least the English government in England. So we should start with that. You should have your document out, and you should start with the very first section, which is very, very radical. And it says, when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. In the history of the world, most people up until this time had associated ecclesiastical power with secular power. In other words, government was always either endorsed by God, through the church, right? The head of, the queen is the defender of the faith. The King of England is the head of the Church of England. And that's true pretty much everywhere. And go back to Hammurabi's code, he says he got it from God, or God approved. I can't remember exactly. In this case, what's so incredible is while we mention God, it's not clear, like it's not saying that it's God's authority here, right? If you read the separate and equal station which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, really means that people can decide um, what they're entitled to, right? And that governments are essentially instituted among people for it's bizarrely it's not quite secular purpose, right? Because if you have inalienable rights, it's going to come later. It means they do come from God, but it means that there's no adjudicating authority here, and that's a huge problem in American law. What's the adjudicating authority? How are you going to establish authority once you've said that people can disband government, right? And I mean, the government is all about coercion at the most basic level. Government makes you do things you otherwise didn't want to do, right? Whether that's being drafted in war, or if you want somebody else's car, right? Someone's got a beautiful vintage Jaguar that they are letting rust in their driveway, right? And they don't seem to care about their car. And you would take wonderful care of this vintage Jaguar. You want it far more than the guy who's letting it rust. It's going to dust, but it ain't your Jaguar, right? Well, you could say, well, my natural right, and by the right of the Jaguar, I should be able to take that Jaguar. But we need a government in there to tell us that you can't do that, whether you want to or not, whether even sort of in an abstract level. Just governments are instituted to coerce people into behaviors they otherwise wouldn't do. Otherwise we wouldn't bother having government, right? I mean, at the most basic level, governments are coercive. So how you establish that coercion, how do you establish a new government, is really, really difficult, which is how we get into the second, and in some ways even bigger, statement that Jefferson's going to make here. Jefferson's the writer of the Declaration, although he was working from an outline that many men, including Ben Franklin, had sort of given him. But it's Jefferson's words. He says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among them are a life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." That is so huge, right? Like, none of these are well defined. I mean, other than the government, I guess, can't kill you for no reason, though, there's the death penalty and there's war. So governments do kill people all the time, and every government to some degree is involved in that. Liberty is hard to define, right? In the history of America, we've defined liberty very differently at different times. For example, dirty or lewd material for most of American history has been illegal. Of course, now it's perfectly legal and it's floods the internet. Gambling is often illegal. Now it's perfectly legal, and you can't watch a football game without being harassed to bet on the game, nonstop. And the pursuit of happiness is, the pursuit of happiness, that's so huge, right? And it's not that these things aren't important, right? It's not unimportant, but they're difficult, right? And it says, to secure these rights, government instituted among men, deriving the just power from the extent of the governed. And whenever any form of government becomes destructive of this ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. So it's extremely difficult to establish authority from that premise. But that's the goal of American government, is to find a way to establish authority, given that there are universal human rights, at least according to our Declaration, and to create a government that conforms to those rights. So when you think about all the documents that we're going to be covering over the next few weeks, just remember we're thinking about those things, and that's going to be hemmed in, at least in many ways, by the traditional understandings that people had of government. Because when we think about the founders of our republic, they were Englishmen living in America. They all saw themselves as Englishmen before the Revolution, which was pretty quick, right? And so when we go to the complaints part, so when we go down in our Declaration of Independence, we're going to get to the part where they're saying these are the things the king has done that violate these fundamental rights that are listed as essentially universal rights. But look closely. It says he has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions of the right of the people. So it seems to be going back to the English Bill of Rights, right? We have a right to a parliament, and the king has abolished our parliaments, which was true. He has refused for a long time such dissolutions to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers, incapable of annihilation, have returned to the people for their exercise. the state remaining in the meantime exposed to all the dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within. In other words, he's taken away the legislative power, the governmental power. Now, it's interesting because Jefferson also includes in there that now the regular people of America have a right to legislative power, right? And they're going to assert that when they create first the Articles of Confederation and then the Constitution. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices, the amount of payment of their salaries. He has erected multiple new offices. So in other words, the king has taken on arbitrary power. And that's really at the core of what they're talking about. There is a deep fear among the writers of our Constitution and the Declaration of Independence that there will be arbitrary power that will not be based in the legislature. And when we get to our Constitution, you're going to find that we will define liberty and define pursuit of happiness, not as just raw abstract phenomenon, although that's going to be in there, but that they are going to define liberty, and they are going to define even the pursuit of happiness to some degree is the ability through a legislature, through a controlled and an orderly process for the people to express their will, and for we to be ruled by law and not by an arbitrary executive that is not harnessed by the law. And so anyhow, that's I think that's basically it for today. So that's the Declaration of Independence. It was a long video. I hope you enjoyed it, and we will see you next time.